Ladies and gentlemen,
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, today we have part 2 of our 2-part series on why everything other than the price can make or break a deal. And of course, we have back again the fabulous Stephen Groves, Director of Quinn M&A, who deals in mid-market transactions, sales, mergers, acquisitions, and valuation advice. So if you missed part 1, then maybe you just might want to head back now and listen to part 1, because we have a really good discussion there all about a number of matters that buyers and sellers don't necessarily immediately think about as being as important or more important as price in their negotiations. And today we are continuing on with that theme. So here we go. Great. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for coming back onto the Deal Room Podcast to serve up part 2 of our episode about why everything other than the price makes or breaks a deal.
Joanna, thanks very much for having me back on. It's an absolute pleasure to be here again.
Well, look, I had a lot of fun talking about each of these areas in part 1, but we're only halfway through. So let's recap. What were those 2 areas that we talked about in part 1?
So we had a discussion about warranties, and it's a really interesting area. As you know, as a commercial and corporate lawyer, Joanna, warranties get thrown into contracts. Some aren't too risky. Some are a little bit dangerous for some sellers to accept, and accordingly, they can cause some difficulties in accepting offers that might have a really great price but have some really funny warranties thrown into a deal. The other interesting area that we spoke about was buyers being unsuited to a business. So we touched on a couple of things, especially with relation to customer contracts and ensuring that they can be assigned, because it's a high-risk area.
And actually, I know part 1 was buyers being unsuited, but just before we leave that as a topic, I think that it's an interesting reflection on buyers being unsuited as well. I mean, it's difficult because I guess no seller wants to sit there and say, well, am I really going to assess the ability of the buyer to run this business? And to a degree, that's their issue once they take over the business. But there's a lot of discussion around about the high rate of failure of M&A transactions from the perspective that quite often they don't meet the target goals. So I guess the usefulness in all of this is that, well, I guess why is it that a seller should care whether or not the buyer is a good buyer or is unsuited? Why do you think it's relevant to them?
Look, I think there's a couple of factors that come into play. Firstly, if buyers are unsuited, a transaction may actually never proceed. So if during a sales process a buyer comes along and a seller thinks, gee, this is great money, they're going to throw all this cash at us to buy the business, let's go and do due diligence with them and start trying to draft up contract terms. Everyone goes off on their merry way. Due diligence is done. And as part of due diligence, a month and a half down the track, the buyer turns around and inevitably says, we think there's some significant risks for us in buying this business because we don't believe that we'll be able to service your major customers in their contracts that they have in place. Or alternatively, you go ahead and you exchange contracts, and as part of the process of finalising the transaction, go out to your major customers and they turn around and say, these buyers that you've put forward to us, we're not going to provide them with any further work. We don't like them.
Or the staff hate them and don't like the culture. There's no cultural fit, so key people start leaking, out, which is particularly problematic if that happens.
Absolutely. The other interesting area, and today we're going to touch on payment terms. So in probably 70 to 80% of the transactions that I run, there is always some component of the payment terms which are deferred. Now, it might be an earn-out, a commission, might even be vendor finance. But if there's risks surrounding a buyer, and if there's an issue that the seller can foresee that might indicate that the buyer won't be suited to running the business long term, that can put a whole host of jeopardy over the deferred payment arrangements which might be included in a transaction. So it's highly risky.
I think you were bang on there. I think that is the highest risk that can come from a buyer that's unsuited to the transaction. It's this deferred payment scenario, because there are so many issues that I have seen where issues have arisen in whether or not earnouts have been triggered, or deferred payments being made, or whatever the case may be, have related back to this fundamental issue between the wrong cultural fit, or for some reason the buyer just not being suited to the business or the culture of the business as a whole.
Absolutely. And I find a very pragmatic approach works well, and it comes back to how you prepare the business for sale. So one of the processes that I think is remarkably valuable to undertake during the preparation process is to put together a target list of buyers, potential buyers, and to undertake some analysis on each of the buyers. Firstly, to assess their capacity. So do they have the capacity to buy? Do they have the financial position to enable them to acquire something? And secondly, to assess their capability. Now, I'm lucky in the sense that basically all of the transactions that I advise on are business-to-business sales. So one company is selling to a competitor or selling to a company up or down their supply chain. So strategic transactions, which means that for a lot of the bigger companies, we can see their financial position as a starting point, and we can also see a lot of information about what work they currently do and how suited they are to a transaction. Without noting as part of that a lot of the strategic buyers, like competitors, normally get a lot of advantage as well out of buying companies, which means that they might pay a premium. So by spending time at the start to go through and identify who the buyers are likely to be and who's suited, it can really shortcut the transaction process and eliminate some of the risks of having a buyer come through who just won't work in the long run for the transaction.
And of course, this is probably even more so a bigger issue for the buyer than the seller, obviously, if they're throwing down money for a company or a business that they're not suited to, and then they only discover this once they're in, and, they find value leakage because of the lack of suitability of them. But I find so, but in many instances, buyers are far more keyed into this as an issue because it's more obvious, I guess, coming into a business. Having said that, not all buyers are. So I still think there's a lot of work for many buyers to do on really drilling further into this. But the point is that it's not as obvious an issue for the sellers. And I guess that's why we're focusing on that today.
Yeah, look, absolutely. It's not something that many sellers, in my experience, will put great weight on, but I find it to be something that's very, very important to look at.
Yeah. And just the last thing that I want to throw in there, because I guess we've spent quite a bit of time talking about this particular element, but it is an interesting element, is if you are a smaller business that's selling into a large business, say, for example, a listed entity or an offshore-based entity, fundamentally there will almost always be very large cultural differences and process and systems differences and probably pricing differences also, from the customer side. And so I guess that in and of itself is, if you are evaluating that type of pool of buyers, which many businesses will be because they will come in with a higher price point, I guess that in itself is perhaps a trigger for you to think about this, because that can be a bit of a flag.
Well, look, absolutely. As part of my practice, I sell quite a number of professional services firms. I don't know how I ended up getting into it, but it does come up quite a bit. And for professional services firms, if hourly rates are not consistent between the two practices, so the seller and the buyer, quite often a transaction just won't work. So I think of the example of an accounting firm. If an accounting firm has partners charging at $400 an hour and they're looking at selling to a firm where partners bill out at $700 an hour, that could be an issue, in the sense that clients who come over to the new firm that buys out the practice may get a bit of a shock when their bills start coming in. It's a third or 2/3 higher than what they traditionally have been, and it can really cause quite a few problems.
Large client leakage.
Absolutely.
Namely.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. All right. Well, we've really given that area a big run, I guess, but the unsuited buyers, but I think for good reason. What else do you have there on your list, Stephen? What else should we be considering other than price that can make or break a deal?
Look, as we've just touched upon, and it's probably the most obvious factor, and it's payment terms. So, look, like I said, about 70%, and I'm pulling numbers out of the air here, but 70%, if not more, of the transactions that come across my desk that I advise upon have some form of deferred payment terms. Now, this can be commissions, this can be earn-out arrangements, it can be vendor finance. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, normally, buyers like to put these types of deferred payment arrangements in so that the risk is shared between the seller and the buyer post-transaction. And by risk sharing, that means that after completion of a sale, the seller still has risk in the business that they've just sold. Now, some sellers are quite comfortable with this, especially if they're selling off a low base and they think that the company that they're selling is going to have significant improvements over the next few years post-transaction. An earn-out arrangement can work quite well in those circumstances if they're confident that the business will improve. However, if there's a significant amount of downside risk, and buyers look to incorporate, for example, an earn-out into the transaction payment terms, that can scare a lot of sellers off accepting deals, even though the deals might have pretty reasonable or good prices attached to them. It's a major, major area. The other interesting component of this is vendor finance terms and the risk of companies simply running into strife after a deal's been done. So if you're entering as a seller, if you're providing vendor finance, you're essentially becoming a bank. And as part of the process, if you don't have very, very good security over something like real property, like a first mortgage, which 9 times out of 10 vendor finance doesn't incorporate security of that calibre, there's a risk. If the buyer doesn't turn around and continue to make payments back to you for your finance agreement, you might be out of pocket and have a couple of choices, one of them being litigation, which might cost too much money to make it worthwhile. So major risk to consider. Now, it all comes down to the circumstances. Some sellers are happy to wear risk, happy to wear more risk than other sellers. And if they are, and if the price is good and all the other terms appear reasonable, then they might accept offers like that. On top of that, it depends what's happening with the transaction campaign itself. If there's one buyer and only one buyer, unfortunately, from a seller's perspective, they might need to give a few things away and be a little bit more liberal with what they accept than what they would like to accept. But it's a major risk and it can cause issues with transactions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find in many instances the issue that comes to us from the seller perspectives, sellers are just, they're worried about deferred payments, not so much deferred payments as a whole, earnouts in particular, for good reason, because we see lots of issues that occur when trying to ensure that they're triggered if there is no control or not enough control of the seller and in the operation of the business up until the point of the trigger of the earnout. And I think that's a really important consideration, just working through the amount of control that a seller has. Also bearing in mind, though, that things might also not be entirely rosy once the buyer and seller start interacting together post-completion, because quite often the idea of that is far better than the reality, in my experience.
Absolutely. Everyone's friends, and then when the check gets handed over, things can go downhill very quickly. But, I mean, having said that, it's very easy to dwell on the negatives and the risks of deferred payment arrangements. However, I find they can actually be quite useful tools to use in order to beef up an offer. Now, what I mean by that is if I have a buyer who's offered $5 million for a business in cash on settlement, and that's their best possible offer, and they won't give us $1 more, one of the easiest ways to try and squeeze a couple of extra bucks out of them can be to have a discussion around putting in place a vendor finance arrangement or an earn-out arrangement in order to derive a little bit more remuneration from the deal moving forward. Now, if all you were going to get was $5 million in cash on settlement, and you can squeeze some extra money through vendor finance or an earn-out, then great.
Okay, so that's the payment term issue, which in itself does allow a little bit of creativity, obviously. And I guess the one point that I would make on all of this is that quite often this is the point that we will end up with our clients if they're particularly concerned, coming at it from the perspective of saying, well, what's the minimum amount that we would be happy with for the sale of this business, and then considering an earn out or however it's created on anything on top of that as a bonus is a good way to mentally approach it if that's the benefit that is going to be driven. Of course, we don't want to do that and then relax our approach on making sure we actually try and tie it in as much as we can. But I think that's a good mental approach to have towards earn-outs in some instances where there's a lot of concern about whether or not there's enough control to ensure that they're triggered. Okay, all right. So what else? What else do you have in your tool chest there, Stephen, of what else is important other than just price?
Well, look, there's the last thing that I wanted to touch upon, and there's a bit of a story behind it, actually. But
we love stories.
Love stories. There are just so many things apart from price that can make or break a transaction, and we'll never be able to cover them, regardless of how many of these chats we have. But I remember clients of mine a couple of years ago now, we received an offer from a buyer that was located in Texas over in the United States. My clients were located in Sydney, Australia. And the buyer put forward a very generous offer, great terms in general, except for one. And the one term that was just obscene was a term that required my client's business's premises to be relocated from Sydney to Texas, and in doing so, for all of the key management staff to relocate from Sydney to Texas. Now, maybe if there was one management team member who was a little bit comfortable with that, it might have worked. But there were 5 key management team members. Each of them had set up shop here in Sydney and lived in Sydney for some forever, some for most of their lives, with families and commitments and the like. It was a really interesting term to get, and it obviously meant that the deal would never work. And it was a genuine deal breaker for the Texan buyers that we had. They didn't like the idea of having business operations in Australia. They liked the business. Interestingly enough, my clients' business operations were doing work primarily in the United States, so they thought it would make sense to move the entire business over there, but it just didn't work. So there's so many.
I can understand why, Stephen. I can understand
why. Absolutely, and it just goes to demonstrate that there are so many intricate little funny terms that will get thrown into a proposed transaction beyond price that can absolutely be deal breakers. Price is important, but there's so many other factors at play, this being one of them, and the other factors that we've discussed over the last 2 discussions that we've had are also important too.
And so let's just for a moment then touch on the buy side. And of course, we've talked about that a bit all the way through, but in particular for buyers out there, do you have any tips? Particularly, I guess you're sitting here at the pointy end where you're with the sellers when they're receiving offers. What is it that buyers can do to make their offer more attractive, other than just price? I'm sure price is clearly, obviously part of it.
Price is absolutely key. From a buyer's point of view, my view is the big risk that a buyer should try and avoid is putting forward an attractive offer that contains little more than a price. then running in and spending a hell of a lot of professional fees and time conducting a due diligence to then formulate an extended set of terms which are unreasonable to a seller. So the best way for buyers to navigate this process, I find, is for buyers to be as descriptive as they possibly can when putting forward their initial offer. If a seller only wants to hear a price, that's fine, but I would still encourage buyers to essentially sit down with their advisors, be it their due diligence advisors, their transaction advisors, their legal advisors, and based on what they know prior to due diligence, spell out what the terms will be. Now, typical terms that I find should be addressed are price, obviously, but how are you going to pay the price? What type of payment terms would you like to incorporate into a potential deal? Where are you going to get your funding from? Sellers love it when buyers put forward offers saying, we have a finance arrangement that's been long-standing with Westpac Banking Corporation and we have a credit line with them for $10.5 million. Fantastic. A seller sees that and they think, wow, these buyers have the capacity to buy and they can complete a transaction. Also spelling out what your plans are as a buyer for the future role of the directors, shareholders and management team. What role do you want them to take? Normally buyers have some idea as to how they see these things playing out. And if you can provide an indication when placing forward your offer, a seller will be able to better understand your offer and be able to better understand whether they are interested in conducting a due diligence exercise with you. And as a buyer, it's important to understand that the initial offer is, generally speaking, 99 times out of 100, non-binding and subject to due diligence. So the process of due diligence allows you to refine the terms further and to adjust based on what you find out. But at least at the outset, if you can put forward a very all-encompassing offer that discusses price but discusses a whole host of other terms, the seller will be far more comfortable with you as a buyer, and you'll be mitigating your risks as a buyer, and understanding whether the seller is on board for what you want to put forward or not at the outset.
Absolutely fabulous ideas there. Some really sensible and wise words, Stephen. I just want to thank you so much for this two-part series. I think it's really been interesting. We've touched both on the buy side and the sell side. I think it's really good to have these discussions about all of the other things that are relevant other than just price. Obviously, as lawyers who are quite often sitting in the depth of the detail, we see firsthand everything else that can be relevant other than price. But I just think it's really good to have, someone who's sitting at the pointy end of negotiating the transaction who also is on board with this idea that there's so many things that are really fundamentally important other than just price. And some of the best transactions that I have seen have been where, well, I guess number one, obviously, where there's competitive tension, because that can be a very important element in making sure you're getting the right deal, is in the sellers actually not choosing the highest price and going with better terms, because I think at the end of the day, that's something that really can be the measure of a transaction that ends up going along a lot smoother and quicker, because at the end of the day, no one is happy with these long, arduous processes, particularly if they have a risk of falling over at the end.
Absolutely. Preparation's key, and the success or failure of transactions, fortunately or unfortunately, is often a detail-oriented exercise. So having your eyes wide open to these things is so important, as I know is your experience, Joanna. So it's been an absolute pleasure.
Brilliant. Stephen, thank you.
Pleasure.
I've absolutely loved the discussion. How do our listeners contact you if they're interested in getting information about working with you or talking about this area more?
Look, thanks, Joanna. I'm a director at Quinn M&A, so your listeners can either Google Quinn M&A or visit us at www.quinnma.com.au.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, look, thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming and joining us for not one, but 2 episodes all on this interesting topic.
Thanks, Joanna. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed every minute of it. So thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for part 2 of our 2-part series with Stephen Groves from Quinn M&A, all about why everything other than price makes or breaks a deal. I hope you found the 2 parts interesting listening. Of course, once again, you've just listened to part 2, so if you haven't heard part 1, then just skip back in this podcast series and you'll find it just before this episode. And if you'd like more information about this topic, then head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com, where you'll be able to link straight through to Stephen at Quinn M&A. And of course, on our website, you'll also be able to find details of how to contact our lawyers at Aspect Legal if you or your clients would like to discuss any legal aspects of sales or acquisitions. Well, that's it. Thanks again for listening in. You've been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast very proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. Aspect Legal has a number of great services that help businesses prepare for a sale or acquisition, to help them prepare in advance and to get transaction ready. We've also got a range of services to help guide businesses through the sale and acquisitions process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. We provide a free consultation to discuss your proposed sale or acquisition. So see our show notes on how to book a time to speak with us, or head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room Podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.